1944. Western Europe. They carried no rifles. They commanded no troops. Yet entire German divisions moved and died because of them. In the final year of the war in Europe, the United States deployed an army that officially did not exist. No tanks, no artillery, no combat record, only sound, only shadows, only belief. From Normandy to the German border, this hidden unit created fake divisions, phantom river crossings, and imaginary armored buildups, convincing the enemy that American forces were massing where there was nothing but air and canvas. German commanders rerouted reserves, counterattacks were delayed, real American soldiers advanced against defenses that should have been lethal. The deception was so effective that its operators worked closer to enemy lines than many infantry units. Armed only with inflatables, radio signals, and psychological precision. This is the story of America's ghost army, artists who became soldiers, illusionists who reshaped the battlefield, and a war that was shortened, not by firepower, but by making the enemy believe the wrong story. Northern France, June 1944. The invasion had already torn open the Atlantic Wall, but the battlefield that followed was unstable, fluid, and brutally uncertain. American forces were pouring into Normandy, expanding fragile beachheads into narrow corridors of control. Every mile inland exposed them to counterattack. German armor remained intact beyond the hedgerows, repositioning, probing, waiting for weakness. Commanders understood a hard truth forming behind closed maps and pencil marks. Firepower alone would not be enough. Something else was required. Something that could move enemy divisions without firing a shot. Hidden far from the beaches, in fields and forests that bore no markers of importance, a unit began assembling that did not resemble an army at all. There were no tank battalions forming up, no artillery lines digging in. Instead, trucks unloaded crates of canvas, rubber, sound equipment, timber frames, paint, wire, and cables. Men arrived carrying sketchbooks instead of rifles, drafting tools instead of range cards. They were artists, engineers, sound technicians, set designers, architects, illustrators. On paper, they were a headquarters unit with an unremarkable designation, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their mission was not to fight the enemy, it was to deceive him. The men understood the risk immediately. Their work would place them closer to German lines than many combat units. They would operate with minimal protection. If discovered, there would be no defensive perimeter, no armored relief, no fallback position. Their only weapon would be belief, specifically, the enemy's belief that a powerful American force existed where none actually did. Training was accelerated and unconventional. Inflatable tanks were erected and collapsed again and again until crews could deploy them in minutes. Canvas trucks were positioned to cast convincing shadows at dawn and dusk. Sound units learned how to project the noise of armored divisions, engines, tracks, metal clatter over miles of open ground, calibrated to terrain, humidity, and wind. Radio operators rehearsed disciplined chatter, copying the transmission habits of real divisions down to call sign errors and procedural quirks. Every detail mattered. Tire tracks were dragged into mud at the correct spacing. Campfires were placed where aerial reconnaissance would expect them. Insignia were changed, then changed again to suggest the movement of entire divisions. The goal was never perfection, it was plausibility under stress. As the American advance pressed inland, the Ghost Army moved with it, always just behind the front, always where the Germans were watching most closely. Their presence allowed real American units to maneuver unseen. It forced German commanders to misallocate reserves. It bought time, hours, sometimes days, when hours were measured in lives. This was warfare reduced to its psychological core, not destruction, but manipulation, not strength, but perception. And as the campaign in Western Europe intensified, the success of the American advance would increasingly depend on an army that existed only in shadows, sound, and belief. The deception war had begun. England, October 1943. By the autumn preceding the invasion of Western Europe, Allied planners were no longer asking whether deception could work. They were asking how deeply it could be embedded into operations without collapsing under scrutiny. The German command structure had become hardened by years of war. It distrusted sudden movements, questioned incomplete intelligence, and relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts to validate assumptions. To defeat that system, deception would have to be layered, disciplined, and continuous. American intelligence assessments made the problem clear. German operational doctrine prioritized reserves. Panzer divisions were not fixed to a single sector. They were held back, mobile, waiting for confirmation of the main Allied thrust. If those reserves could be misdirected, held in the wrong place for even 48 hours, the balance on the ground would shift decisively. Infantry advances would meet weaker resistance. River crossings would go uncontested. Breakouts would become possible, where stalemate had been expected. The challenge was scale. False information could no longer be improvised by individual units. It had to suggest the movement of entire divisions, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, sustained over days. That level of illusion demanded specialization. It demanded control over what the enemy saw, heard, and intercepted, across air, ground, and signal intelligence, simultaneously. This requirement gave the Ghost Army its strategic relevance. Unlike conventional deception efforts, which supported a single operation, this unit was designed to function as a mobile illusion factory. It could be inserted along threatened sectors, build a believable presence, and then vanish, reappearing elsewhere under a different identity. Each deployment was calibrated to the enemy's expectations. German analysts were not meant to be fooled forever, only long enough. Training emphasized restraint as much as creativity. Overstatement was dangerous. Too many tanks, too much radio traffic, or unrealistic movement patterns would invite scrutiny. The Ghost Army learned to copy the imperfections of real units: uneven spacing, inconsistent schedules, minor logistical errors. Radio operators deliberately mimicked the habits of specific American divisions, down to their pacing and message formats. Visual teams studied how sunlight struck canvas at different times of day, how shadows pooled under vehicles, how aerial photographs compressed distance and depth. The American command structure supported this approach with unusual trust. Deception plans were integrated directly into operational orders. Real divisions adjusted their movements to reinforce false ones. Engineers built roads that led nowhere. Traffic control points were established to be seen, not used. The Ghost Army was not a sideshow. It was woven into the main effort. German reliance on visual confirmation became a vulnerability. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, increasingly limited by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, often captured only brief snapshots of the front. Analysts had to extrapolate from incomplete data. When inflatable tanks appeared where rail lines suggested they should, when radio traffic matched known divisional patterns, the conclusion felt safe. Decisions followed accordingly. This asymmetry favored the Americans. Asymmetry favored the Americans. Deception required time and planning, but it conserved lives. Every German unit redirected by illusion was one less unit opposing real advances. Every delayed counterattack reduced pressure on exposed American infantry. The Ghost Army transformed uncertainty into a weapon, one that compounded the advantages of air power and logistics, already in Allied hands. By the time Allied forces crossed the beaches and pushed inland, deception was no longer experimental, it was doctrine. And the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops would soon be tested under conditions where discovery meant annihilation, and success meant remaining invisible. Normandy, July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy created a battlefield unlike anything American forces had trained for. Thick earthen walls and dense vegetation fractured the front into hundreds of isolated engagements, each one limiting visibility, movement, and coordination. German units exploited this terrain with discipline, anchoring defenses to villages and road junctions, forcing the Allied advance into slow, costly attrition. For deception to function here, it had to operate dangerously close to the enemy's line of sight. The Ghost Army moved forward as the real front advanced, positioning itself just beyond artillery range but within reach of German observation. Their task was no longer abstract. German patrols probed constantly. Artillery ranged forward areas with growing accuracy. Luftwaffe reconnaissance, though weakened, still appeared unpredictably. Illusion now had to survive contact. In fields scarred by shell craters, inflatable tanks were deployed at dawn and repositioned before dusk. They were arranged not in parade order, but in the scattered imperfect formations, typical of units pausing between movements. Canvas trucks lined tree cover. Tracks were dragged repeatedly through mud to suggest heavy traffic. Engineers constructed dummy command posts with visible antenna rays, carefully angled to be detected from the air. Sound units operated only at night, when distance blurred reality. Recorded armor movements rolled across the countryside. Engines revving, metal clanking, tracks grinding. Broadcast at volumes calculated to travel just far enough. German listening posts, already conditioned to expect American mechanized units pushing forward, logged the noise as confirmation. The effect was cumulative. Reports fed into maps, maps informed decisions. Radio deception intensified. Operators transmitted false orders, logistical requests, and movement updates in patterns copied from active divisions. Messages were brief, sometimes careless, sometimes delayed, precisely the kind of imperfections German analysts trusted. The illusion suggested buildup, the illusion suggested intent. German commanders responded predictably. Units were repositioned to face threats that did not exist. Reserves that could have reinforced collapsing sectors were held back. Artillery fire shifted toward empty ground. American infantry advancing elsewhere encountered thinner resistance, shorter engagements, fewer counterattacks. The danger to the Ghost Army escalated with each success. Artillery shells began landing closer to dummy positions. Reconnaissance aircraft circled lower, longer. On several occasions, German patrols moved toward false encampments, close enough that discovery would have been immediate. Each time, the deception held just long enough for the unit to dismantle and relocate, leaving behind nothing but disturbed soil and fading tracks. This phase proved the concept under pressure. Deception was no longer preparatory, it was operational. The Ghost Army was shaping the battlefield in real time, influencing enemy decisions, hour by hour. Their proximity to combat erased any illusion of safety. If captured, their work would not be misunderstood. It would be interpreted as sabotage. By midsummer, the results were undeniable. American forces broke through sectors previously assessed as heavily defended. German reactions lagged behind reality. The battlefield began to stretch, then tear, and as the front destabilized, the Ghost Army prepared for its most consequential role, yet supporting a breakout that would determine whether the war in Western Europe remained a grinding advance or became a rapid collapse. Northern France to the German border. Late summer to autumn 1944. By the time American forces burst out of Normandy and began racing east, the tempo of the war changed beyond recovery. What had been a contested front transformed into a pursuit. German formations retreated, regrouped, and retreated again, struggling to establish coherent defensive lines. In this environment of motion and uncertainty, deception became more powerful than at any earlier stage of the campaign. The Ghost Army was no longer supporting a fragile beachhead. It was now enabling speed. Its deployments were timed to coincide with moments when German commanders faced impossible choices: reinforce one sector and abandon another, or hesitate and risk collapse everywhere. Illusion gave those commanders false certainty, and false certainty produced fatal delays. As American armored columns surged forward, The Ghost Army established convincing concentrations along likely crossing points and avenues of advance. Inflatable tanks and artillery appeared opposite river lines that would not be used. Radio traffic suggested preparation for deliberate assaults where no attack was planned. German intelligence assessments, already strained by the pace of retreat, interpreted these signs as confirmation of major American efforts forming up. One of the most critical moments came as Allied forces approached key river barriers. German doctrine demanded that such crossings be met with concentrated resistance. Yet again and again, reserves arrived late, or not at all. Ghost Army operations suggested crossings at multiple points simultaneously, forcing German commanders to disperse what strength remained. When real American units crossed elsewhere, they encountered defenses that were incomplete, thin, or already withdrawing. The psychological strain on German leadership intensified, reports conflicted. Reconnaissance confirmed formations that vanished within days. Radio intercepts pointed to divisions that never engaged. The battlefield no longer behaved according to expectation. Each deception compounded the last, eroding confidence in assessments that had once been reliable. For the Ghost Army, the danger was constant. They operated ahead of friendly infantry, often with nothing between them and German positions except distance and darkness. Their equipment could not withstand direct fire. Their protection depended entirely on remaining believable, long enough to be misinterpreted. When artillery fire bracketed dummy positions, teams worked through the night to reposition and reconfigure, maintaining the illusion even as shells landed nearby. The payoff was measured in momentum. American advances accelerated. Fuel shortages plagued the retreating enemy, while American logistics kept pace with the moving front. Towns fell with minimal resistance. Defensive lines that existed on German maps dissolved under pressure that never fully materialized where expected. By the time American forces reached the approaches to Germany itself, deception had become inseparable from maneuver. The Ghost Army's work no longer simply protected units. It shaped entire operational outcomes. German commanders, deprived of reliable indicators, reacted instead of planned. Every hesitation widened the gap between perception and reality. This was the breaking point. Illusion applied with discipline and precision had reached a scale where it could fracture an enemy's ability to respond at all. The battlefield belonged increasingly to those who controlled not just firepower but understanding, and yet the war was not over. One final deception would test the Ghost Army under the most desperate conditions of the European campaign, when the enemy would gamble everything on a last violent reversal. Western Germany, early 1945. As the war entered its final phase, the battlefield narrowed and hardened. German forces, though depleted, fought with renewed desperation as Allied armies closed on the Rhine and beyond. In this environment, deception became more dangerous than ever. There were fewer reserves to misdirect, fewer safe assumptions to exploit. Every illusion had to be precise, or it would collapse under scrutiny. The Ghost Army's final major operations reflected this reality. Their most consequential effort came during the winter crisis that followed the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. As American lines strained under sudden pressure, Allied commanders needed time to regroup, redeploy, and stabilize the front. Deception provided that time. The Ghost Army was tasked with simulating American strength along vulnerable sectors, suggesting the presence of formations that could not yet be committed. Inflatable armor appeared where roads and terrain implied readiness. Radio traffic suggested reinforcement and coordination. Sound units projected activity into areas the enemy was probing cautiously. German commanders, uncertain whether they faced renewed American mass or isolated resistance, hesitated. That hesitation blunted momentum at a moment when speed was essential. When Allied forces finally crossed the Rhine and advanced into the German heartland, deception followed close behind. Ghost Army deployments implied crossings where none would occur, masking real movements until bridgeheads were secure. German units arrived late, misdirected by signals that had been designed not to deceive forever, but to delay just long enough. By the time Germany surrendered, the work of the Ghost Army remained largely invisible. Their operations were classified. Their existence was unacknowledged. They returned home without public recognition. Their equipment packed away, their contributions absorbed into broader victory narratives dominated by divisions and corps. Only later did the scale of their impact become clear. After-action reports revealed German units repeatedly misallocated, reserves held back from decisive engagements, counterattacks delayed or redirected toward empty ground. American casualty figures in sectors supported by deception were consistently lower. Entire advances had been made possible not by overwhelming force, but by manipulated perception. The legacy of the Ghost Army reshaped modern warfare. Deception became institutionalized, studied, refined. Psychological operations, information warfare, and battlefield simulation all trace their lineage to the principles proven by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their work demonstrated that control of information could rival control of terrain. They were artists who learned to think like soldiers, soldiers who learned to think like the enemy. Their battlefield was the mind, their victories measured in movements never made and attacks never launched. America's Ghost Army did not conquer cities or raise flags. It did something more enduring. It proved that wars could be shortened not only by force, but by understanding, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is the story the enemy believes.